My brother raised his glass at Thanksgiving dinner, looked directly at me down the length of the table, and said, loud enough for all 14 people to hear, to real jobs, not, whatever it is you're doing these days, with your little app thing. A few people laughed, the uncomfortable kind of laugh that happens when nobody's sure if they're supposed to. My aunt shot me a sympathetic look. My mother said, Trevor, in the mild, toothless tone she's used to not quite correct him my entire life. And Trevor just sat there, pleased with himself, sipping his wine, waiting for someone to ask him about the new job he'd been not so subtly hinting about all dinner. Someone did. My uncle asked where he'd landed after his last company did layoffs. Trevor smiled the smile he's had since he was 11 years old, the one that means he thinks he's about to win something. He said the name of the company, a logistics and supply chain software firm, mid-size, growing fast, apparently one of the best places in the industry to be right now, according to Trevor. He said he was starting as a senior operations manager in 3 weeks, reporting straight to the executive team, and that he'd heard the leadership there was sharp, like, actually sharp, not garage startup sharp. Another small, pointed glance in my direction. What Trevor did not know, sitting at that table, glowing with the specific self-satisfaction of a man who thinks he's just quietly out-earned his little sister for the first time in years, is that the company he'd just accepted an offer from was a company I had co-founded 4 years earlier, sold 60% of 18 months ago, in a deal that made me more money than Trevor will likely earn across his entire career, and still sat on the board of, with direct input into every senior hire above a certain level. He was about to start working, in 3 weeks, for a company where I had a standing seat in the room where his hire had already been discussed. He had no idea, and I decided, sitting there at that table, holding my wine glass instead of raising it, that I wasn't going to tell him. Not that night. I was going to let him find out on his own, in exactly the way that would matter most. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how long Trevor had been building toward that toast, and how badly he'd misjudged who he was about to work for. I'm 29. 4 years ago, I co-founded a software company with 2 former colleagues, building inventory and route optimization tools for regional logistics companies, the unglamorous, deeply unsexy back-end software that keeps freight moving efficiently, the kind of business nobody puts on a magazine cover, but plenty of people are quietly willing to pay a lot of money for. We started in a shared workspace, with 3 laptops and a spreadsheet of 40 prospective clients I'd personally cold emailed. My brother Trevor is 32. He works in operations management, moving between mid-size companies every 2 to 3 years, always landing somewhere with a good-sounding title and a story about how the last place just wasn't the right fit. A phrase I've heard him use at almost every family gathering for a decade to explain why he was, once again, between jobs or freshly re-employed somewhere new. I want to be fair to Trevor for a second, because this story isn't really about him being incompetent. He's a genuinely capable operations person, and that's actually important later. This story is about something else, a family narrative, built over years, about which of us was the practical one, and which of us was taking a risk that probably wouldn't pay off, and how completely, aggressively wrong that narrative turned out to be. Here's how the narrative got built. Trevor has always had a corporate job with a recognizable company name, a title our parents could say out loud at their own social gatherings without having to explain it. I, on the other hand, spent the first 2 years of my company's existence with basically no salary, living in a cramped apartment, working 80-hour weeks on something my parents did not understand, and worse, did not seem to want to understand. To them, startup meant risky. It meant unstable. It meant, more than once at family dinners, a slightly embarrassing thing to mention to their friends, compared to Trevor's steady march through titles at established companies. I need to walk you through 3 moments from those years because they explain exactly why that Thanksgiving toast landed the way it did and why I made the decision I made in response. Moment 1. About 3 years ago, during the hardest stretch of building the company, we'd just lost our second largest client, and I hadn't paid myself a real salary in 5 months. I mentioned some of this, honestly, at a family dinner, mostly because I was exhausted and needed to talk to someone. My father's response was to ask, in front of the table, whether I'd thought about maybe getting something more stable in the meantime, just to have some security, as though building a company was a hobby I could pause to go get a real job, and as though 5 months of no salary was evidence of failure rather than an entirely normal, expected phase of building something from nothing. Trevor, sitting across from me, said, "Yeah, that seems smart, honestly," with the specific tone of someone enjoying being on the stable side of a comparison for once. Moment 2. A year and a half ago, we closed our first major partnership deal, a contract with a regional distribution network that effectively tripled our revenue overnight and validated 4 years of work in a single signature. I told my family at the next gathering, genuinely excited, expecting this to finally be the thing that shifted how they saw what I was building. My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey," and then, within about 90 seconds, was asking Trevor about his recent promotion to team lead at his then company, a much smaller professional milestone that nonetheless received considerably more sustained interest and follow-up questions than my company tripling its revenue had. Moment 3, the one that really set the stage for Thanksgiving. 8 months ago, my co-founders and I sold 60% of the company to a private equity group specializing in logistics tech, in a deal that gave each of the 3 of us a payout most people don't see in a lifetime, while allowing us to retain meaningful equity and, in my case, a board seat with real influence over major strategic and personnel decisions going forward. I told my parents the number, plainly, factually. My father actually laughed, not meanly, I think, more out of genuine surprise, and said, "I had no idea it had gotten that big," which, while not unkind, was its own quiet confirmation of exactly how little attention any of them had actually been paying to what I'd built over 4 years. Trevor's response, when he heard the number secondhand from our mother a few weeks later, was to make a joke at the next family gathering about how he should have gotten in on the ground floor, delivered with just enough edge that I understood it wasn't entirely a joke. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around 8 months after that sale, I had spent years absorbing a quiet family consensus that my work was a risky, slightly embarrassing detour, while Trevor's steady rotation through corporate titles was treated as the real, admirable path. Nobody in my family had ever quite caught up to the actual scale of what I'd built, because none of them had ever really tried to understand it in the first place. Here's the part of this story my brother had absolutely no way of knowing, because the 2 halves of it, my role at the company and his job search, were happening in completely separate worlds that neither of us had any reason to connect until they collided at that dinner table. After the sale, I stayed on the board specifically because the acquiring group wanted continuity from the founding team, and because, frankly, I still cared deeply about the company's direction. Part of my role involves sitting in on senior hiring decisions. Not every hire, but anything at the operations manager level and above, since those roles directly shape how the product actually gets delivered to clients, which is the part of the business I know best. It's not a ceremonial board seat. I ask hard questions. I've pushed back on candidates before. I take it seriously. About 6 weeks before that Thanksgiving, our VP of Operations brought a short list of candidates to the board for a senior operations manager role, a genuinely important hire, reporting into a newly restructured leadership team, exactly the kind of position that gets real scrutiny before an offer goes out. I reviewed the shortlist the way I review every shortlist, reading through resumes and interview notes without initially paying close attention to names, focusing mostly on experience and interview performance summaries our VP had prepared. One candidate had a strong operations background, solid interview feedback, decent references, standard stuff. It wasn't until I glanced at the resume attached to the file, actually looked at the name at the top, rather than just the summary, that I saw it. Trevor's full name, his actual employment history, laid out in a document I was reviewing in a professional capacity, listed with the exact job titles and company names I'd half listened to at a dozen family dinners without ever quite connecting them to anything real. I sat with that for a long moment. I want to be honest that my first instinct was almost protective, some old, automatic sibling reflex to make sure he got a fair shot regardless of anything else, so I didn't influence the process. I recused myself from directly voting on that specific hire, disclosed the family connection to our VP and the rest of the board as a matter of basic governance, and let the normal hiring process run its course without any input from me one way or the other. Trevor's interviews, his references, his performance in the process, all of it was entirely his own. He got the offer because he earned it on his own merits, evaluated by people who had no idea he was my brother. What he didn't know, accepting that offer 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, was that the person who'd quietly recused herself from his hiring vote, the person who would, in her ongoing board role, continue to have real visibility into leadership decisions at the company he was about to join, was sitting directly across from him at their parents' dinner table, listening to him call her company a joke. I want to walk through exactly how the toast happened, because the timing of it is what makes this story work. Dinner had been going for about 40 minutes. Trevor had already mentioned, twice, unprompted, how excited he was about the new job. A real step up, he called it. Finally somewhere with actual leadership that knows what they're doing. I said nothing, mostly because I was still processing the strangeness of sitting across from someone about to join a company I helped build, who had absolutely no idea. Then came the toast. Glass raised, that specific self-satisfied smile, the line about real jobs and my little app thing, delivered with enough performance in it that I understood, clearly, this wasn't a spontaneous joke. This was something Trevor had been sitting on, waiting for the right moment to land in front of the widest possible audience. The table did its usual uncomfortable laugh. My mother said his name in that same soft, ineffective way, and I sat there, wine glass untouched, deciding, in real time, that I wasn't going to correct him. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't enjoy imagining what was coming, but because I understood, instinctively, that telling him at that table would rob the moment of the thing that actually mattered. He needed to find out through the company itself. He needed to experience, professionally, exactly what it felt like to have spent years dismissing something he'd apparently never bothered to actually look into. So I smiled. I let the toast pass, and 3 weeks later, Trevor started his new job. I want to walk through how this unfolded slowly, because unlike a single dramatic confrontation, this reversal happened gradually, over Trevor's first 2 weeks on the job, in a way that I think made it land even harder than if I'd simply told him at dinner. I wasn't in the building day to day. My board role doesn't work that way. But I do attend quarterly leadership sessions and occasional strategy meetings with the senior team, and I'm listed, by name, on the internal org chart and investor materials every new employee receives during onboarding, specifically under founding team and board. According to our VP of Operations, who told me this later with what I can only describe as barely contained delight, Trevor's reaction happened during his second week, during a standard onboarding walkthrough of company history and leadership structure, when a slide came up listing the founding team. My name was on it, My full name, the same one on my brother's driver's license, the same one he'd grown up calling out across a dinner table for 29 years. Our VP said Trevor went quiet for a noticeably long moment, then asked, carefully, whether that was a coincidence, gesturing at the name. The onboarding coordinator, having absolutely no idea about any family dynamics, cheerfully explained that no, that was in fact one of the co-founders, still actively on the board, still involved in major decisions, and that she was, as it happened, going to be at next month's leadership off-site. Trevor did not say anything else for the rest of that meeting, according to our VP, who mentioned afterward that he'd seemed a little pale. Actually, is everything okay with him? Trevor called me that night, not a text, an actual phone call, which from Trevor, who communicates almost exclusively in memes and one-line texts, told me immediately how rattled he was. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with, "Why didn't you tell me?" A question with a very specific tone to it. Somewhere between accusation and genuine bewilderment, as though I'd somehow wronged him by not correcting his own assumptions before he made them out loud at a family dinner. I told him the truth, calmly. I said I didn't know he'd applied there until his file crossed my desk during the hiring process, and that once I did know, I made a deliberate choice to stay out of it entirely and let him earn the job on his own, which he had. There was a long pause. Then he asked, quieter now, whether I'd had anything to do with the offer. I told him no. I told him I'd recused myself, disclosed the relationship to the board as standard governance practice, and had zero input into the decision. I told him, honestly, that he'd gotten the job because our VP of operations and the interview panel thought he was genuinely the strongest candidate, which was true, and which I think mattered to him more than he expected it to, hearing it stated plainly rather than assumed. Then I said the thing I'd been sitting with since that Thanksgiving toast. I asked him if he remembered what he'd said about my little app thing. He went quiet again. Then he said, quietly, I didn't know it was that big a company. I thought it was still just you and a couple guys in an apartment somewhere. I told him it hadn't been just me and a couple guys in an apartment for at least 2 years, and that if he'd ever once asked me a genuine question about what I was building, instead of making the same joke at every family dinner for 4 years running, he might have known that before he stood up with a glass of wine in his hand. I won't pretend this resolved neatly into some warm sibling reconciliation montage, because it didn't. Not immediately, and I think pretending otherwise would make this story feel less honest than it actually was. Trevor was, for the first month or so at the company, visibly uncomfortable around anything connected to me, avoiding eye contact at the one leadership offsite our schedules overlapped at, keeping conversations rigidly professional, clearly still working through the strange vertigo of realizing the sister he'd spent years quietly condescending to was, in fact, someone whose name was on the wall of the company now paying his salary. What actually shifted things wasn't one big conversation. It was smaller, over months. Trevor started, slowly, asking real questions, not performative ones, actual curiosity about how the company had grown, what the early years had actually looked like, what the sale process involved. I think working inside the company, seeing firsthand the systems and relationships and years of groundwork that had gone into it, did something that 4 years of me trying to explain it at dinner tables never managed to do. He saw it operating, day to day, and understood, finally, that it wasn't a hobby that had gotten lucky. It was a real business, built deliberately, over years, by people who knew exactly what they were doing. At Christmas, about 6 weeks after that Thanksgiving, Trevor made a toast of his own. Much quieter this time, no performance in it, he said, looking at me. That he owed me an apology for years of comments he probably thought were harmless, and clearly weren't, and that working at the company had shown him something about my work he should have taken the time to understand a long time ago. It wasn't a long speech. It wasn't especially eloquent, but it was real, and it was the first time in years he'd said anything about my career that wasn't, in some form, a joke at my expense. I didn't need the apology, honestly. What actually mattered to me more was watching him do the job well, genuinely well, over the following months, because Trevor is, underneath the years of family dinner posturing, a capable operations person, and it turns out he does good work when he's not performing status for an audience. Our VP mentioned, a few months in, that he'd become one of the stronger managers on the team. I found that, unexpectedly, more satisfying than the awkward phone call had ever been. I think about why this particular story stayed with me longer than the satisfaction of the initial reveal, and I keep coming back to the same idea. It's not really a story about a startup, or a job offer, or even about Trevor specifically. It's a story about how easy it is for families to build a hierarchy of what counts as real success. Stable titles at recognizable companies, the kind of thing you can say out loud at a dinner party without having to explain it, while dismissing anything that doesn't fit that template, no matter how substantial it actually is. Trevor didn't dismiss my company because he'd looked into it and found it lacking. He dismissed it because it didn't look like success in the specific, narrow shape his, and honestly, our whole family's, mental model recognized. If you've ever built something real that the people closest to you refuse to actually look at closely enough to understand, I think you already know the particular flavor of that Thanksgiving toast before I even finish describing it. That's a very specific, very common kind of dismissal. Not malicious exactly, just lazy, the result of people substituting an old assumption for the effort of actually asking a real question. What I've come to appreciate most, looking back, isn't the moment Trevor found my name on that slide. It's the fact that I didn't need to engineer that moment at all. I just kept building something real, on my own terms, and eventually the truth found its own way into the room, the same way it usually does, if you're patient enough to let it. If you've made it this far, I want to know, has someone in your family dismissed something you built, right up until they couldn't anymore? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of the best stories on this channel have started exactly there. If this story felt familiar, there's more like it on the way. I post a new one every few days, so if you don't want to miss the next one, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.